everyone, Ellie here, and welcome to part 4 of my Raphtalia build log. We've been working on this costume for quite some time, and I am extremely excited to be finishing her up today. In today's video, we are going to be focusing on Raphtalia's armbands, as well as her gloves and her boot covers. So, if you guys are ready, let's go ahead and get started. Before we start cutting into any fabric, I'm going to go ahead and sketch out Raphtalia's boot design. Her boots look seemingly pretty complicated, but they're actually pretty simple once you break them down. At the top, you have a cuff, followed by a darker brown segment that wraps around her leg with crisscross straps at the front, and then the rest of the boot is a light brown pleather material. Once I had my design figured out, I went ahead and did a bunch of measurements of my leg to figure out how long and wide I needed my boot covers to be. After this, I kind of just winged it. Legs are always the same shape, usually at least, so it's pretty easy to just kind of wing a shape that looks like a leg. It's a lot like a sleeve, but for your leg, I guess. After cutting out my shapes, I made sure they fit over both my leg and the boot that I was planning on wearing. After that, I made a few final adjustments, and then I was able to stitch up my main leg pieces. Once these were stitched together, I went ahead and tried them on with the boot that I planned on wearing with these covers, and thankfully it fit pretty well. After this, it's time to move on to the dark brown wrap that goes around Raphtalia's knee. I'm using the same materials that I used for my chest armor, so I'm a little short on supplies, but I think we'll be able to squeak it out. After I cut out my shape, I wrapped it around my knee to make sure it fit, and decided that I needed to have a bit of a curve in the back of this piece, so I stitched that up with my machine. After that, I was happy with how this knee piece looked. Now I'm going to be moving on to making the pleather bands that go between the two pieces on my knee. This is exactly the same method that I used for Raphtalia's overdress and for her chest armor. I've just folded these pieces of pleather and then top stitched them. Now that I have my leather binding, it's time to go ahead and attach it to my brown knee cover. I'm measuring out where I want these crisscrosses to go, and then I'm going to be pinning my binding into place. Now, of course, this is a bit of trial and error to figure out exactly where you want these pieces to be, but eventually you'll get there. I'm going to attach these pieces with a basic straight stitch. And after they've been attached, I'm going to put this piece back over my knee to see where the other end should hit. Once I've figured out where I want these crisscrosses to go, I'm going to pin them into place, and then I'll be able to top stitch the other side as well. After I had my first set of crisses pinned in place, I went ahead and pinned in the crosses. Get it? Crisscrosses? Having the first set in place first really helps keeping these crisscrosses even and makes them look really nice and clean. Now here's where I did something a little bit silly. I thought it would be a really great idea to top stitch all of these crisscrosses into place while still keeping this entire knee piece as one solid piece. If you can't tell, I'm really struggling, but I did it, it worked, and it looked okay. I tried on this piece and I think it looks wonderful, but now it's time to add this light brown insert that goes behind my crisscrosses. My original idea was to top stitch this into place, but obviously that's not really gonna work if this is all one piece. So, since there is a seam in the back of this knee piece, I'm just gonna split this open down the back, and then I'll very easily be able to top stitch everything into place, and it's going to look nice and clean. Now that everything is top stitched into place, it looks really nice, and we can go ahead and stitch back up the back of that knee piece. Now it's time to construct our entire boot cover. I am placing my brown tube over top of my knee piece, and then I'm going to be folding over the hem of the brown tube, so that way I can top stitch it and everything will be nicely finished. I think it's an important thing to say that boot covers are nowhere near my strong suit. More often than not, I'll try to buy a pair of shoes that looks at least similar to the character I'm cosplaying, and then I'll modify or paint those shoes to make them look a bit more accurate. So making boot covers is totally out of left field for me. And while these boot covers, I was able to wear them, they weren't exactly comfortable and they were near impossible to take off. I also have varicose veins in my legs, so they kind of change size depending on how my legs are doing. So in the end, I did end up splitting these all the way down the back, and then I added some elastic in the back, so this way they'll be able to easily slip on and off of my leg. And it doesn't detract too much from the visual of them, since the elastic looks a lot like the crisscross on the front of the boot covers. Now anyway, let's continue moving on. Next, we're going to be adding the cuff that goes around the top of Raphtalia's boots. I'm using this really nice suede material, and I'm simply going to be making one long rectangle that I fold in half and finish off both of the edges, kind of like making a waistband. Once I've stitched down both of these edges, I'm going to trim off my corners and then flip it inside out. Once it's been flipped inside out, we can pin it inside of the thigh opening of our boot covers, and then we'll top stitch all the way around here and flip it inside out. Now, of course, once I ended up adding the elastic backing, this all changed a little bit because I ended up completely lining the boot covers and adding this elastic backing and all this crazy stuff, but this concept still works. And here's what my final boot covers look like. As you can see, all the top stitching is still there. They've just been lined for a bit of comfort. I've also added some weathering with some acrylic paint. Along the back, you can see that there is a cotton panel as well as some black elastic straps that allow for these boot covers to stretch over my legs and my boots and are very comfy while being worn. With Raphtalia's boot covers out of the way, I'm moving on to working on her gloves. I'm using a pair of store-bought gloves that I bought off of Amazon. I had tried making a pair of gloves with the pleather that I had, but they were kind of uncomfortable and it was a really long process, so I decided it would be easier to go ahead and buy a pair. Raphtalia's gloves do have a bit of a longer gauntlet style to them, so I'm adding this long tube to our gloves made out of the pleather that I've used for our boot covers and our breast cover. I'm also going to be lining this pleather piece just to keep everything cozy, so I've also cut these pieces out of my cotton. And of course, we also have suede cuffs that go on the top of Raphtalia's gloves, so I made a tube out of those and then folded them in half so that we'll have a nice clean edge. Next, I'm going to be attaching my cuff by putting against my pleather layer, and then I'm going to put the cotton layer on top of that, so we're sandwiching this nice little cuff in between our two layers. We're going to stitch all these layers together with a straight stitch, and then we'll be able to turn this inside out, and we'll have a nice cuff sticking out from between our two layers. Once we have our gauntlets ready, we're going to go ahead and attach them to our glove. So with right sides together, I'm pinning my glove to my gauntlet at the wrist line, and then we're going to go ahead and stitch this all together. After that, I'm going to trim off the excess of my glove and turn everything right side out. And now we have a nice glove with a gauntlet and a cuff. After that, it's time to add the forearm protectors that Raphtalia has on her gloves. Again, I'm using the pleather that we've used for all of her other pleather parts, and a bit of craft foam. I'm cutting a rectangle that's about as long and as wide as my glove and my gauntlet. After that, I'm going to be shaping it a little bit so that it tapers in at the wrist and back out at the top of the hand. And then I'm also going to curve it at the bottom where it meets my hand. Once I'm happy with my shape, I'm going to start pinning my pleather all the way around my craft foam shape. Once it's been pinned into place, we're also going to go ahead and top stitch this. As you can see, it gives a nice effect, and while it doesn't look exactly like real leather, I think it looks close enough and it looks really nice with our gloves. Once these pieces are both finished, we're going to go ahead and attach them to our gloves by hand using some very gentle stitches along the same stitch line that we used to attach the pleather to our craft foam. This way our attachment is as invisible as possible. Now that our gloves are mostly out of the way, we're going to start working on the silver cuffs that Raphtalia has on her arms as well as on her wrists. I'm using some silver pleather that I've had for quite a few years, and I'm going to be cutting some long strips out of it. These strips are going to be as wide as my arm, plus about 2 inches of overlap. Once I've cut out all of my strips, I'm going to be cutting out some craft foam. I'm going to make this as wide as my strips, or basically 3 times as wide as my finished product. I know I shouldn't be using my gingers on this, but I was too lazy to find my craft scissors, and sometimes the gingers just gotta go on craft foam. I know, it's terrible, but it cuts like butter. Anyway, we are now going to take these craft foam pieces and we are going to fold them 3 times over so they create a bit of a thicker craft foam, and then we are going to be folding the pleather over this and pinning it into place. You could also use a thicker craft foam if you'd like, but I had this thinner stuff on hand and I think it works just as well. Plus, it gives you a really nice and round edge, whereas if you used a thicker craft foam, you might get a sharp edge. After that, I'm going to go over by hand and whip stitch my pleather into place, making sure I catch both edges and hold everything nice and tightly around the craft foam. Now that our bands have been stitched into place, we're going to go ahead and add some snaps. We're going to be adding 4 snaps to each of these bands. 1 in the center that will attach to the back of the sleeve, 2 on each side that will attach to each other to create kind of a 3D banded effect, and then 1 as close as possible to one of those other snaps that will attach on the outside of our sleeve. This way, everything will stay nice and tight on our arm, and you don't have to worry about them falling down or drooping. You want to make sure to attach these snaps really well, as these pieces will most likely be getting bonked around and hit as you're walking around the convention. Now that we've added those snaps to our silver bands, it's time to attach the corresponding pieces to our white underdress. There are going to be 2 snaps on each sleeve, 1 on either side. This way we'll very securely hold up those bands. In the end, your silver armbands should look something like this. They're long silver tubes, and I've gone ahead and used some black acrylic paint to weather the edges. Then you can snap together the 2 edges and put them onto your arm and snap it onto your white dress. And while these don't look exactly like metal, they're a very nice, lightweight, and flexible alternative. And that's all I have for Raphtalia. Thank you guys so much for sticking around through this series. I hope you all really enjoyed it. I loved each and every part of this costume. From the white underdress to that red and brown overdress and the chest armor, it was all so much fun to make, and I got to learn a bunch of new techniques. I hope you learned some new techniques as well. Now, as we learned, there are definitely some things that I could have done better or differently. So don't be afraid to deviate and try some new techniques yourself. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite part of this build series was. I would love to hear all about it, especially if you're using my build logs to make your own Raphtalia costume. Be sure to send me photos or tag me on Instagram @EllieEverts. So, I hope to see you all later, and until then, keep sewing, stay positive, and have fun. I'll see you all later. Bye!